Hey Pop, what was your rank back in the Stone Age? Mess cook, 3rd class? The voice, slick with the unearned confidence of youth and peak physical conditioning, cut through the low hum of the mess hall. It belonged to Petty Officer Miller, a Navy SEAL whose neck was thicker than most men's thighs. He stood with 2 of his teammates, their trays laden with the kind of high-protein, high-calorie fuel required to forge human weapons. They formed a tight, intimidating triangle around a small square table where one man sat alone. George Stanton, 87 years old, didn't look up from his chili. He brought a spoonful to his lips with a hand that was steady, a stark contrast to the wrinkled, liver-spotted skin that covered it. He wore a simple tweed jacket over a white shirt, clothes that looked out of place and out of time amidst the sea of digital camouflage and navy blue uniforms. He chewed slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall of the bustling Naval Amphibious Base Coronado dining facility. Miller smirked at his buddies who chuckled in appreciation of their leader's wit. "I'm talking to you, old-timer. This is a military installation. You got a pass to be here. Or did you just wander in from the retirement home looking for a free lunch?" The mess hall, never truly quiet, began to change its tune. The cacophony of 100 separate conversations began to falter. The clatter of forks and knives on ceramic plates became more distinct as other sounds faded. Heads were beginning to turn. This was more than just a young buck being loud. It was a performance, and an old man was the unwilling centerpiece. George finished his spoonful of chili. He placed the spoon down gently beside his bowl, the metal making no sound against the plastic tray. His movements were economical, devoid of any wasted energy. He still hadn't made eye contact with the SEAL looming over him. This placid refusal to engage seemed to fuel Miller's arrogance. He leaned in, planting his massive tattooed forearms on the table, a clear invasion of the old man's space. The table, bolted to the floor, didn't so much as shudder. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Miller's voice dropped from a mocking tenor to a low growl. "We have standards here. We don't just let any civilian stroll in and take up a table. So I'm going to ask you again, who are you and what are you doing on my base?" The possessive pronoun, my base, hung in the air, thick and odious. Several of the younger sailors at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably. They knew Miller, knew his reputation. He was a phenomenal operator, a warrior of the highest caliber, but he carried his trident like a scepter and treated anyone outside his elite circle with a casual disdain that bordered on contempt. George finally turned his head. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, seemed to hold a profound weariness, but underneath it there was something else, a stillness, a depth. It was like looking at the surface of a frozen lake, calm and reflective, hinting at the immense cold pressure hidden beneath. He looked at Miller's face, then at the gold-sealed trident pinned to his chest, and then back to his eyes. He said nothing. "What, you deaf?" One of Miller's friends chimed in, leaning over his shoulder. "He asked you a question. Let me see some ID," Miller demanded, straightening up. His hand gestured impatiently. Now, this was a gross overstep of his authority, and everyone in the room knew it. A petty officer had no right to demand identification from a visitor in a common area. That was the job of the master-at-arms, the base security. But no one was going to call out a SEAL in the middle of the mess hall. The social cost was too high. It was easier to look away, to pretend you didn't hear, to suddenly find your green beans intensely fascinating. George Stanton reached not for his wallet but for his cup of water. He took a slow sip. The silence in the immediate vicinity of the table was now almost absolute. The tension was a living thing, coiling in the air. Miller's face was flushing with anger. His public challenge was being met with quiet, implacable indifference, and in the rigid hierarchy of military life, that was an intolerable sign of disrespect. He was being made to look foolish. "That's it," Miller snapped. "You and me, we're taking a walk to see the MAA. Get up, now." He pointed to a small tarnished pin on the lapel of George's tweed jacket. It was a simple design, a pair of stylized wings with a small shield in the center, its details worn smooth with age. "And you can explain what that cheap little trinket is. You buy that at the surplus store to impress the ladies." As Miller's finger jabbed dismissively toward the pin, the world around George seemed to momentarily recede. The smell of industrial-grade chili and bleach was replaced by the scent of ozone and damp earth. The low murmur of the mess hall became the high-pitched scream of a diving Zero, the percussive thud of anti-aircraft fire echoing in his bones. He felt the phantom pressure of a hand on his shoulder, a young man's hand, strong and sure. A voice, barely a whisper over the roar of battle, saying, "See you on the other side, Ghost." The memory was a flash, a single frame of film from a lifetime ago, but it was as real as the table in front of him. The pin on his lapel was not a trinket, it was a promise, a ghost of a memory, for the ghost of Luzon. He blinked, and the mess hall solidified around him once more. Miller's angry face was inches from his own. Across the large room, working the serving line, was Seaman Apprentice Davis. At 19, Davis was still new to the Navy, full of idealistic notions about honor and respect that the reality of daily life was slowly sanding away. He had been watching the encounter with a growing sense of sickness in his stomach. He'd seen his own grandfather, a proud Marine who fought at Chosin Reservoir, treated with similar casual dismissal by a world that had moved on and forgotten. Seeing it happen here, on a base, in a room full of service members, felt like a sacrilege. He saw the smug looks on the faces of the other SEALs. He saw the averted eyes of the other sailors. He saw Miller's hand move toward the old man's shoulder, an act of aggression that was a point of no return. Davis knew he couldn't step in. He was a seaman. Miller was a SEAL. Intervening would be career suicide, but doing nothing felt like a betrayal of everything he was supposed to stand for. His eyes darted to the phone mounted on the kitchen wall. An idea, desperate and probably stupid, sparked in his mind. He knew who to call. Not the MAA. They'd likely side with the operator over the old man. He needed someone higher, someone who dealt not just in rules but in history. Wiping his hands on his apron, Davis slipped back from the serving line into the clatter and steam of the main kitchen. No one paid him any mind. He walked quickly to the wall phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dialed the extension for the office of the Command Master Chief, a man known throughout the base simply as the Anchor. Master Chief Thorne was a living legend, a man who had forgotten more about naval tradition and history than most scholars ever learned. If anyone would understand, it would be him. The phone was answered on the second ring by a yeoman. "Master Chief's office. I need to speak with him. It's urgent," Davis said, his voice a low, rushed whisper. He glanced over his shoulder through the service window, seeing Miller now placing a hand on the old man's arm, trying to force him to his feet. "He's in a meeting, Seaman. I can take a message." "No, you don't understand," Davis insisted, his voice cracking with stress. "There's a situation in the mess hall. A SEAL, Petty Officer Miller, is harassing an elderly veteran. He's putting his hands on him." The yeoman's tone became bored, administrative. "File a report with the MAA, Seaman. The Master Chief doesn't handle." "The veteran's name is George Stanton." Davis cut in, the words tumbling out. "He's just sitting there, not doing anything. Miller is making a scene." There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, profound silence. Davis thought he might have been hung up on. Then he heard a muffled voice, the yeoman saying, "Master Chief, you need to hear this." A new voice came on the line, gravelly and hard as barnacles on a hull. "This is Master Chief Thorne." "What did you just say?" "Master Chief," Davis stammered, standing a little straighter even though no one could see him. "Seaman Davis, galley. Petty Officer Miller is about to drag an old man named George Stanton out of the mess hall." Another silence, but this one was different. It was heavy, charged with an energy Davis couldn't comprehend. He heard a sharp scraping sound, like a chair being violently pushed back from a desk. "Son." Master Chief Thorne's voice was dangerously quiet, stripped of all formalities. "You keep your eyes on George Stanton. You do not let him out of your sight. Help is on the way." The line went dead. In the command building a quarter-mile away, Master Chief Thorne stood so abruptly that his coffee cup rattled on its saucer. His face, a roadmap of harsh sun and sea salt, had gone pale. The yeoman stared at him, wide-eyed. "Get me the base commander on my private line." "Now," Thorne commanded, his voice a low thunder. He was already grabbing his cover, the insignia of the highest enlisted rank in the Navy gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "And find out if Admiral Hayes is still in his car. His convoy was supposed to be leaving for the airfield 10 minutes ago. Get them on the radio. Tell them to turn around. Tell them it's a matter of operational history." The yeoman, scrambling to comply, didn't understand the words operational history, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of a sleeping giant being prodded with a sharp stick. He had never seen the Master Chief move with such frantic, controlled urgency. It was the kind of energy one expected before a fleet action, not because of a squabble in the chow hall. He fumbled with the phone, his mind racing. Who on earth was George Stanton? Back in the mess hall, Miller's patience had finally evaporated. The old man's serene refusal to be intimidated was a public indictment of his authority. He had gone too far to back down now. He tightened his grip on George's thin arm. "All right, Grandpa, that's it. You're done," he snarled, pulling the old man from his chair. "You have the right to remain silent, because I really, really want you to. You are a security risk on a secure facility, and you're coming with me for a nice long chat with people who have ways of making you talk." This was his final, irreversible overreach. He was unofficially arresting a civilian, threatening him, all because of his own wounded pride. The remaining conversations in the hall died completely. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system. Every eye was now fixed on the scene, a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity on the faces of the onlookers. George rose to his feet, not because of the force Miller was applying, but with a slow, weary grace, as if he had simply decided it was time to stand. He looked small and frail next to the hulking SEAL. It was at that precise moment that the main doors of the mess hall burst open with such force that they banged against the interior walls. The sudden loud noise made everyone jump. Framed in the doorway stood the base commander, a Navy captain with a chest full of ribbons and an expression of cold fury. Flanking him was Master Chief Thorne, his face a granite mask. Behind them were two Marine guards in full dress uniform, their presence so unexpected and formal that it sent a shockwave of confusion through the room. And stepping through the doorway between them, with a quiet, deliberate authority that made the air itself seem to grow heavy, was a man in a crisp white service uniform. On his shoulders were the 3 silver stars of a vice admiral. The spectacle was so stunning, so out of context for a Tuesday lunch, that for a moment no one moved. Then, a ripple of action spread through the hall. Sailors and officers seeing the rank shot to their feet, chairs scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. A wave of bodies snapping to attention, all except for Petty Officer Miller. He was frozen, his hand still clamped on George Stanton's arm, his mouth slightly agape. His brain was struggling to process the scene. The base commander? The Master Chief? An admiral? Here? Now? It made no sense. The admiral's eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the room for a fraction of a second before locking onto the small tableau at the center of it all. He ignored the salutes, ignored the commander, ignored everyone. His gaze was fixed on the old man in the tweed jacket and the SEAL who was holding him. He began to walk forward. His steps were measured, silent on the polished floor. He moved with an unhurried purpose that was more intimidating than any charge. The base commander and Master Chief Thorne fell in behind him like a Praetorian guard. The entire population of the mess hall held its collective breath. The admiral stopped directly in front of George's table. His eyes went from George's calm face to Miller's hand on George's arm. Miller's grip, which had seemed so powerful moments before, now looked like a desecration. The admiral's gaze was like a physical weight, and Miller felt a bead of cold sweat trace a path down his spine. He finally, belatedly let go of George's arm as if it were a hot coal. Then, the admiral did something that shattered the reality of everyone watching. He squared his shoulders, brought his heels together with an audible click, and raised his hand to his brow in the sharpest, most respectful salute Miller had ever witnessed. It was a gesture of profound deference, an offering of respect from a 3-star flag officer to a stooped, anonymous old man. "Mr. Stanton," the admiral's voice was clear, ringing with a respect that bordered on reverence. "It is an honor, sir. I apologize for this disturbance. We had you on the visitor manifest for the memorial dedication, but my aide didn't inform me you had arrived. Please forgive the lapse." The entire hall was a frozen diorama of disbelief. "Mr. Stanton." "Sir." The titles coming from an admiral seemed to defy the laws of military physics. Miller's face, which had been flushed with anger, was now the color of ash. His bravado had completely disintegrated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The admiral lowered his salute but kept his eyes on George. He then turned his head slightly, his voice rising to address the silent, captivated room. "For those of you who do not know," the admiral began, his tone now that of a lecturer at the Naval War College, "it would be a good idea for you to remember the man you see before you. This is George Stanton. In 1943, as a 20-year-old Navy Combat Demolition Unit specialist, a frogman, the grandfather of the SEALs, he and his team were deployed to the Luzon Strait. Their mission was to disable Japanese listening posts on a series of fortified islands. It was codenamed Operation Nightfall." The admiral paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Miller's eyes were wide with a terror that was existential. He wasn't just in trouble, he had committed a sin he didn't even know existed. Operation Nightfall was a complete disaster. The admiral continued, his voice low and somber. "Compromised from the start. Of the 12 men inserted, 11 were killed in the first hour. Only 1 survived. For 72 hours he evaded capture on an island crawling with enemy patrols. He not only survived, he completed the mission. Alone, he disabled all 3 listening posts using improvised explosives and his knife. When the extraction team finally found him, he was subsisting on roots and rainwater and had taken out 17 enemy combatants without firing a single shot. For his actions, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. They called him the Ghost of Luzon." A collective soft gasp went through the room. The Medal of Honor. the highest, most sacred award. It was a name spoken in hushed tones, a symbol of almost superhuman valor. And this quiet old man who had been mocked for a cheap pin was one of its recipients. The pin on his lapel, the Admiral said, his eyes now boring directly into Miller, who looked like he might collapse, is the original unofficial insignia for his unit. It was given to him by his team leader who died in his arms on that beach. It is not a trinket. The Admiral turned back to George, his expression softening. George, again, I am so sorry. The base commander finally stepped forward, his eyes burning holes in Petty Officer Miller. Petty Officer. The captain's voice was a quiet, lethal blade. You are a disgrace to that trident on your chest. You will report to my office in 5 minutes. You will be escorted by the Master-at-Arms. You will bring your service record. I suggest you use the next 4 minutes to contemplate the epic totality of your mistake. Master Chief, see to it. Aye, Captain, Thorne rumbled. George Stanton finally spoke. His voice was quiet, raspy with age, but it carried an undeniable authority that silenced even the Admiral. He's just a boy, Jim, George said, calling the Admiral by his first name. Full of fire. We were all like that once. Arrogant and sure of ourselves. The service will temper him, or it will break him. That's the way of it. Let the boy learn his lesson, but don't ruin him for it. The grace of the gesture, the sheer magnitude of the forgiveness offered in that moment, was more stunning than the revelation of the medal. Miller looked at George, his eyes swimming with a shame so profound it was painful to watch. As George's hand brushed against his own lapel, the memory of the pin came back, not as a flash of combat but with a quiet, heartbreaking clarity. He was in a muddy foxhole, the tropical rain cold against his skin. His friend, his team leader, was bleeding out, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The man pressed the small metal pin into George's palm, his fingers cold. Make it home, Ghost, he had whispered, a bloody froth on his lips. Make it home and tell them we tried. The pin wasn't a symbol of his victory. It was a memorial to their loss. It was the weight of 11 good men that he had carried on his chest for over 60 years. The fallout was both swift and systemic. Petty Officer Miller faced a formal captain's mast. He was stripped of his rank, placed on probation within the teams, and ordered to write a 2,000-word essay on the history of naval special warfare, focusing specifically on the sacrifices of the pre-SEAL units. But the real punishment was the story. It spread through the command like wildfire. Miller, the arrogant operator, became a cautionary tale, a living example of the sin of forgetting where you came from. The base commander, at the urging of both the Admiral and Master Chief Thorne, instituted a new mandatory quarterly training for all hands on base, from the greenest seaman to the most senior officer. It was called Naval Heritage, and the first lesson was the story of Operation Nightfall, taught by a humbled Master Chief Thorne who used a transcript of the mess hall incident as his primary text. Weeks later, a man in civilian clothes was walking through a park in Coronado. He saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench, throwing small pieces of a sandwich to a flock of seagulls. It was George Stanton. The man, a visibly thinner and more somber Miller, hesitated for a long moment. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and walk away, to hide from the source of his humiliation. But the lesson he was learning was one of courage, and not just the kind that involved facing enemy fire. He took a deep breath and approached the bench. He stood a respectful distance away until George looked up. Sir, Miller's voice was quiet, stripped of all its former swagger. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. George looked at him, his pale blue eyes assessing. He saw not the arrogant SEAL but the chastened young man standing before him. He simply nodded. Sit down, son. Miller sat gingerly on the other end of the bench. They sat in silence for a minute, watching the birds. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth, Petty Officer, George said, not looking at him. Use them in that proportion. The quietest man in the room is often the one you should listen to the most. He's listening too, and he's learning. Miller just nodded, unable to speak. He sat there with the old hero, the ghost of Luzon, and for the first time in a very long time he just listened. If you were moved by George's story, please like this video, subscribe to Veteran Valor, and share it with someone who respects our heroes. Click the notification bell so you never miss a story of the quiet warriors who walk among us.